Welcome to another episode of the SNA Speakeasy. I am very, very happy to say that we have our first repeat guest in the entire series. Now that we've had well over 50 speakeasies, we're going back to some of our early guests to discuss other topics with them, and in some cases to drill down on topics which we had discussed earlier in the year. But David McNeill was our very first guest on the SNA Speakeasy, and now he has returned for Speakeasy number 55. Interesting thing about him in particular is that last time we talked to him, his affiliation was as a foreign correspondent. He spoke to us from the Economist's office in Tokyo, but now he has thrown off his main profession as a journalist and become a university professor. Uh,
I've cast off that youthful carapace that I had and become a crusty old academic. Yeah.
okay, well, why don't you describe who you are and who you were, since this particular speakeasy has everything to do with who you were and what you were doing.
Sure. Well, as you can see, I am in an office now. This is my new job. Well, it has been since April. I'm a professor of communications in English at Sacred Heart in Tokyo. I'm looking at your very impressive bookshelves behind you there, Michael. Mine are not nearly so impressive. You see, I've only just moved in, so there's lots of gaps there. But essentially, what I did was, as you've just said in your introduction, I moved from being a more or less full-time reporter. I say more or less because I did other things as well. I did some copy editing, for example, at NHK, which we can talk about if you like. But essentially made my living from reporting. So for about 20 years, I was initially a reporter with the Irish Times, which is Ireland's premier newspaper, and I still write for them when they ask me to. And then I was a reporter for 16 years for the Independent newspaper in the UK, which of course has since gone belly up, or at least the print version has gone belly up. And that's a sign of the times, and I used the story of the Independent to discuss with my journalism students what's happening to the media and to journalism. And I then worked for a newspaper called The Chronicle of Higher Education, which is a weekly Washington-based specialist publication. I worked for them for about 6 years. And simultaneously to that, I worked for The Economist for 6.5 years, I think. I was the acting bureau chief for The Economist for 2 of those 6.5 years. And also just, because it's relevant to the conversation I think we're going to have today, I have also throughout most of that period had various sort of official roles with the Foreign Correspondents Club in Tokyo. At the moment, I am still the co-chair of the PAC committee. The PAC committee is the sort of heart of the FCCJ. It arranges the press events that run at the Foreign Correspondents Club, as you know. I've also been on the board. I still bear the scars from that. I was on the Freedom of the Press committee and various other things which we can talk about if you like. So that's me. I live in Tokyo. I live in central Tokyo with my 3 kids. And I'm also writing halfway through roughly a book, which so for years people were, as probably the 3 people who are watching today know, you get needled all the time if you have any sort of semi-public role in Japan for being critical of Japan or anti-Japanese. But also, I see a lot of this lately. You're speaking to a foreign audience about Japan. Why don't you tell that to the Japanese? Assuming the Japanese people don't read English. So I thought I would call the bluff, if you like, on that criticism, and that I would write a book in Japanese for Japan about the sort of media, the way the media works here. My preferred title is Confessions of a Foreign Correspondent, implying that not only do I sort of take issue with some of the way that reporting is done in Japan, but I also have problems with the way Japan is reported in the foreign press sometimes too. The publisher wants to turn it into something a little more anodyne. I think they're suggested title is Nihon no Taboo o Miteru Gaikoku Tokuhain or something like that, right? So I'll resist that, I think. I'll resist that title, although in the end, that's their decision.
Well, we
So
should
that's who I
probably
am.
translate that title for the non-Japanese speakers in the world.
Japan's taboos, according to a foreign correspondent, or a foreign correspondent talks about Japan's taboos, I think, is roughly.
Yeah. All right. So, as for the empty bookshelves, don't worry. When I was a university lecturer, I read about 50 or 60 books a week, and that's when all of these got read. Since I became a foreign correspondent, my book reading just came to a dead halt. So everything became, short form reading rather than long form reading.
50 or 60 books is pretty impressive. By the way, just so everybody, I thought, seeing as how some people accuse you of faking things, there's my actual PhD. I'm resting my computer on my PhD, which I haven't seen in about 20 years. I had to dig it up for this new job. So just so everybody knows that I do actually have a PhD.
Okay, so you got it right here. There's been no credentials being faked on our show. So, all right. Well, in our pre-interview, we briefly discussed that as for the confessions that you are going to make to us here before the SNA patrons and ultimately on YouTube to the world, the global audience, there will be 4 confessions, 4 themes. So let's go ahead and jump into it. What is the first confession that you would like to make to the world?
Well, so what I should stress is that when you pitched this talk to me, I thought, well, what am I going to talk about? I'll talk about the book. But the book is a series basically of anecdotes from my experience of reporting, and I thought I would dig out 4. And obviously there are many more, but I thought these might be pertinent because they are issues that are of interest to people, not just in Japan, but outside Japan. So the first one was Okinawa. So as a foreign correspondent in Japan, you quite often get asked to appear on Japanese TV programs or in Japanese publications to discuss the kind of issue du jour. And it's a slightly bizarre ritual in a way, because often they're asking you about issues in the UK or Ireland, and they put a Union Jack on the screen when you talk. Usually, in my case, even though I haven't been home, I haven't actually lived in the UK or Ireland for a generation, so they'd be better off asking one of their own correspondents. In any case, there was an NHK radio show. There still is actually a broadcast in the morning to millions of Japanese people, and they have a slot. It's about 15 minutes long, and it's for a foreign correspondent, anybody who can speak Japanese, essentially. And I was asked by somebody from NHK if I could do this, and I agreed. And what the producer of the show did was they came to talk to me, and they said, "What would you like to discuss?" And I went, "Wow, audience of Japanese people, right, direct to their ears, live radio." So I said, well, I would like to discuss Fukushima. This was 2012. And then he sort of made a face, and I said, oh, well, I would like to discuss whaling, like the policy of whaling in Japan and whether it's in Japan's interest. How about the Imperial family? So kind of went through all of those. I suggested 4 or 5 things. Now I wouldn't have the guts to suggest them, but at the time, these were the things that were on my mind. And every time I suggested something, there was a teeth-sucking sound, or there was a sort of, slightly disapproving look. And the producer said, "Why don't you talk about the Olympics in London?" And I went, "Oh, okay, right, sure, yeah, I can do that." So he took out his laptop. And then I realized that it wasn't me talking freely on live radio about the issue that I wanted to discuss. It was a producer making a script that I was going to read out on live radio. And that was the format. So in other words, he would say, "Why don't you talk about this?" And I would say, "Okay." And then he would say, "Well, try this way," right? So he would write a script for me, which I had to actually have in front of me on air. So what I took away from that was that the NHK is very nervous about allowing people to go on live radio and discuss things, especially someone like me who has a record of discussing things that might be considered controversial. So the script lay in front of me on the day. So basically, as I said, 15-minute slot. Most of that is taken up with other people talking over you, but you have to discuss your main points. And at one point, we were discussing on air the fact that the Olympics, as you remember, were prepared. This was just about a month before they started. London was gearing up for them and so on. And there was a story in the paper which I picked up about a group of residents in the east of London who had objected to a missile defense system which was being put on top of a block of flats. So this was an anti-terrorist measure, yeah? And the people this was in Bow, I think, in East London. And they said that they didn't want this missile defense system on top of their block of flats because they thought that it would make them a target. It would make them unnecessarily a target for a terrorist attack, yeah? So this was all in the script, this was fine. But then I ad-libbed, and I said in Japanese, まあちょっと沖縄のその基地問題についてちょっとまあ似てる部分あるんじゃないですか, right? So don't you think, or doesn't this sound a little bit like Okinawa with the base issue? Because on Okinawa, the people who are against the American bases down on that island, they say the same thing, that they object to the bases partly because in a war or in an attack, they would be targeted by North Korea or China or Japan and America's enemies. And when I finished the show, as you remember, it was live, I went out into the studio, and usually when you go out, you get a "Otsukare-sama desu," you get a thank you or whatever. Nobody said a word, and the producer of the show had this kind of thin bead of sweat on his forehead. And I said, I've been here long enough to sense the air, so I said, 大丈夫でしたか? And he said, いや、沖縄はですね、基本的にno touchなんですよ, right? So we fundamentally, we don't go there. We don't touch on Okinawan issues. And then he proceeded to give me a lecture on why we shouldn't talk about Okinawa. Now, that's one of many incidences where I've been covering Okinawa in Japan. I can tell you, a lot of other anecdotes. But I just found that extraordinary, that Japan's main public service broadcaster had ruled Okinawa off limits for discussion. Now, obviously we're not talking about completely off limits, but what they do is they frame Okinawa within a set of parameters which they understand and they can handle. So the idea that somebody would come from outside, somebody like me, and discuss Okinawa in a free format in a way that might not be acceptable to the higher-ups was deemed unacceptable. And, the other reason why I found it interesting is because that producer, middle-aged, we all know them, very decent person, a middle-aged man, had risen through NHK after graduating from college. He wasn't a bad person by any means. But that kind of self-censorship, is very, very prevalent in many broadcasters. But to see it sort of bared like that, in front of me was very revealing. So that's one of the incidents in the book. Another incident, if I'm not boring everybody, on Okinawa, I used to go down to Okinawa Island once a year, and I was particularly interested in the Henoko story. And I remember being down there about 5 years ago and being on the beach, just outside Camp Schwab. As you know, they're building this huge new base, which extends into the sea. And there's a long fence along the beach which blocks your access into Camp Schwab where they're building it, so on. And the place is surrounded by activists, usually very elderly activists. And there were a bunch of journalists down there from what we might call Japan's liberal media, so the Mainichi, the Asahi, and so on. And I got into a conversation with them about them, as we did. They were asking me, what did I think? And I said, what do you think? And they all said, まあ、沖縄の方たちはかわいそうなと思ってるんですけれども、しょうがない, right? That was the gist of what they were saying. So we feel sorry for the Okinawan people, but this base has to be built. That's, the bottom line. And that was in the liberal media. And I think that thinking on Okinawa inflects all of the mainstream media in Japan, And it was, to me at least, revealing to hear the journalists kind of say that, off the record, of course. And I think that that plays into the way that the mainland people, if that's not an offensive term, see Okinawa. Like in my experience, most people here are not that knowledgeable about what goes on in Okinawa. They don't know, for example, that Okinawa has secretly hosted US chemical and nuclear weapons, or that the vast majority of people on the island opposed the new base, or that in Henoko opposition is, almost total, that the Okinawa media portray the US military as something close to an occupation. All those things are quite foreign to people here in Tokyo, in my experience, outside a small kind of cognoscenti. So that would be my Okinawa story.
All right. Well, with both of those anecdotes, I have very similar stories I could tell, but I'm not going to because this is your show, not mine. But to dig a little bit on the Okinawa story, okay, these are the taboos of NHK. These are the taboos even of the mainstream liberal media in Japan. So as a foreign correspondent, do you feel that there is a radically different kind of reporting going on in the mainstream foreign media? Or do you feel that these narratives are more or less extended into the US and British media?
Oh, I think they are. I mean, I wouldn't. So one of the things I'm very careful about in the book is to hold up the foreign media as some kind of paragon. I think, anybody who thinks that should look at the way that the American media, for example, has operated over the last 20 years, right back to the decision to invade Iraq. They don't cover themselves in glory at all. But I think precisely because they are the foreign media, they don't have the same constraints that the local media does. So if I had to think about my own publication, for example, The Economist was not against reporting on opposition to the bases. Like they were fair in the sense that they would always say that opposition to those bases in Okinawa runs very high, and that this is a severe political obstacle for Tokyo, right, and for Washington if they want to build a new base down there or keep the existing bases. But there were other sort of other imperatives driving foreign coverage, or the Economist's coverage in particular, one of which is that the American-Japan alliance, the US-Japan alliance, is a cornerstone of security in Asia. And it protects us from China, right? And, the Economist has a real hard-on for China, right, as we know. So that meant that you had to kind of get around that, if you like, right? There was a series of kind of editorial hurdles that you had to get by. If you wanted to talk about this opposition, if you wanted to front load that opposition, let's say, right, as I would in a sort of Japan Times article, right, I would sort of front load, I would say the opposition has been fighting this, and look at them, and look how elderly they are, and look how long they've been hanging on, and look how, let's face it, the majority of public opinion on Okinawa is on their side. That's how I would front load it in another publication. In The Economist, it couldn't be written like that, So I do think that there are problems, of course. There are issues in the way that the foreign media reports Japan, as we all know. And I actually take up some of those in the book. I discuss them quite extensively in the book.
All right. Well, speaking of front loading, I don't think we're going to get through all four of the topics we discussed because it's moving a little bit more slowly than we expected. But then again, I actually am not too surprised. So of the remaining three, why don't you pick the one which you are most eager to talk about and make that next?
Well, that's not easy because one is very entertaining, or at least entertaining to me, and two of them are more important in a sense. I mean, I was going to talk about the death penalty, the way that the death penalty was covered in Japan, and maybe we can do that in the Q&A. And I was also going to discuss Fukushima in 2011. But the one that comes to mind, the one that I use when I'm teaching is the Imperial Household Agency. So the reason why I talk about that is because I think it's quite instructive of the press clubs. So in 2007, I tell about this incident where then the Crown Prince Naruhito, he's now the emperor, of course, was about to embark on a trip to Mongolia, and the way that this works with the Imperial Household Agency is that they will allow foreign reporters into those press conferences if a member of the Imperial family is traveling abroad. But they do so in a way that makes it clear that we are there as honored guests, and we have to be, very respectful and so on. So we sit at the back of the room, generally speaking. We ask our question last. We have to ask it in Japanese, which is pretty terrifying. I've done it, once, to very formal Japanese. And of course, before you ask your question, no such thing as a free question, right? You have to submit your question to the IHA, to the Imperial Household Agency, a month in advance. And then there's a lot of yari-tori back and forth before they say, okay, well, this will do. Yeah. So for this particular press conference, we asked a question which was so boring I can't even remember what it was. But what was unusual about it was that 5 minutes before the press conference was scheduled to end, the questions ran out, which is, usually they're very well sort of scheduled. So we were asked if we had another question. And this very stuffy kind of Imperial Household Agency bureaucrat said, じゃあ、5分残ってますので、他の質問ございますでしょうか? And I immediately put my hand up, without even thinking about it, right? Because I knew this was such a great opportunity for a free question. And the sort of seconds ticked by, and it became very clear that this official didn't want me to ask my question. I was kind of surprised. I shouldn't be. But so he kind of looked at me like sideways through his eyes like this, and then scanned the room for somebody else. Anybody, please help me, like this. And Eric Talmage, rest his soul, of AP, the news agency, he's passed, unfortunately, but he also put his hand up. So now there were two Gaijin reporters, in the room who wanted to ask the future emperor of Japan a question. And my question to him would have been about the book, which had just been released about his wife. Not a very good book by all accounts, but one of the striking things the book said was that she was very unhappy and that she wanted to leave the imperial household. So again, I don't know if I would have the guts to ask a question like that, but at the time I was going to ask it, right? And what was really instructive was how the official, as I said, was scanning the room, looking for somebody to help, and then eventually over the other side of the room, there was about 40 reporters. A TV reporter slowly put her hand up, as if to say, "Ja, shogunai na, I'll put my hand up, I'll rescue you," right? And the official said, "Ja, lady first shimashouka," right? Let's have ladies first, he said, right? And she asked her question. Now, what I think, again, I talk about it in several kind of contexts. One is, what was that reporter thinking, right? She was thinking, this guy's in trouble, I have to help him out. And if you think about the sort of, or idealized, I suppose, version of what journalism is supposed to be, we're supposed to have an adversarial relationship with our sources, and with the IHA, with the Imperial Household Agency, because they give so little away, the way that we think is we have to try somehow to get them to give more information than they want to give. Whereas her strategy was, I'll help him out because I'm on the same side, right? You cannot blame the official because he's just protecting the Imperial Household Agent, the Imperial family. That's what his job is, in a sense, right? But how instructive that was in the way that the press club system works, right? And also, what struck me about it was how that reporter, whoever she was, had not only sort of betrayed her trade, in a sense, right, her profession, but she had also betrayed the people who were looking, because I would have asked a far better question. I didn't care about getting into trouble. I didn't care about being thrown out of the Imperial Household Agency, right, or out of the press club, I should say. I just wanted to ask my question. That would have been far better for her and far better for the viewers at home. But all of that was somehow undermined by the mechanics of this press conference. That's my second anecdote.
Well, that was very interesting, and I think also very revealing. But at the same time, you've mentioned twice now, you kind of let slip, that you have been trained over these years, that you're a foreign correspondent, that you've suggested that in your early days, you would say, you just ask your question and say to hell with them all. But
Yep.
now, later on in your career, you've become more cautious, you've become more observant of the taboos of the Japanese media world.
Yep.
Why is that, and what's your attitude about that?
I think I've just been here a long time, and I do think that I think I would be honest about this as well. I haven't written this part of the book, but I would be honest that journalists lose fire in their belly after a certain point. Most of them do, right? I think that after a certain point of being in the same place, like I've been here for 20 years, you start to lose that kind of real, desire to be the guy at the bottom of the class throwing things at the teacher, right? And you just want to dig deeper into stories. I mean, a lot of the times what I was trying to do there was get a reaction. And I think that's a fine, acceptable part of what we do, right? That's a fine, acceptable part of what journalists do. But I think now I'd be more inclined to dig a little deeper into the issues and find out, for example, why does the Imperial Household Agency operate like that? What are they trying to do? I'd be more interested in interviewing the people who run the Imperial Household Agency to try and get under their skin and understand what's going on here. I don't think that that's something that we should try and disguise. And I think it's one of the reasons why foreign reporters are often moved around so much. They, in many cases, they stay in a place for a short period of time and then they're moved on because the editors, the senior ups, fear that they're going to go native.
Well, yes, you mentioned going native, and that was, clearly the term that came to my mind there as you were describing the process. But one thing that's a little unclear in your answer is, in your opinion, is a journalist who is going for the reaction, sitting in the back of the room, throwing stones at the teacher, a better kind of journalist, or is it the one who is, as you kind of suggest you evolved into, one who really wants to get into the mechanics of how things work and to develop more patient and deeper relationships with your sources?
That's a tricky question. I mean, I think that they both have a role, I think that, for example, in the case of the Imperial Household Agency episode, right? Obviously, the IHA would not have been happy with that question. That's precisely why they don't allow us to have free questions. But I think it would have been a very useful thing to have had on the record, because there's so much speculation about the relationship between, or there was so much speculation about the relationship between Naruhito and his wife, and about her unhappiness in particular. In fact, the unhappiness or not of his wife was essentially the main point of interest for the British media. They weren't really that interested in the Imperial family, only in that sense, right? Of marital problems among the future Emperor and Empress, or her depression, and so on. So I think that would have been a useful thing to have known, to have on the record, yeah? But now I'm 55. I have been here for a long time. I think that in my own career, I would prefer to know a little bit more about how the Imperial family works and to tell people more about the background. So I'm not ruling one or the other out. I'm not ruling out the throwing things in the back of the classroom. I think that's a very important thing to do. I just don't know if I would be wanting to do it anymore.
All right. Well, we need to move to the patron Q&A soon, but I think I'm going to throw, and unfortunately we don't have time for Fukushima and death penalty, which I'm absolutely certain many people would love to have heard about. But
somebody can ask me.
Well, this is Speakeasy number 55. Maybe Speakeasy 105 or 110. We can come back to it. But I guess the question I want to ask you is, as a foreign correspondent in Japan and one who's gone native, what kind of what do you think foreign correspondents should be doing in Japan? What should they be reporting about? If you could somehow separate yourself from the commercial imperatives and the editor's demands and everything like that, what kind of journalism do you think is most needed in this country from the point of view of a foreign correspondent?
Well, again, it's a tricky question because, every publication, every foreign outlet has its own perspective and has its own needs. So the Independent my old newspaper used to rely on Japan for news stories, of course, but also for what we would call color stories. The Economist relied on me to write stories about politics, mainly about politics and what was going on with the military, particularly around those bases and so on. I think that what I evolved when I was working for The Economist, what I evolved into was writing stories that I thought that showed Japan the way it was, but also stories that were interesting or unusual to foreign readers that were happening in Japan that weren't happening elsewhere. So the one that we tended to do a lot on for the 6 years when I was at The Economist was stories about Japan's aging demographic. So here's a point where Japan is getting old, its population is shrinking. These are issues presumably that many of the other advanced economies will experience. What does Japan tell us? What kind of things is Japan doing that's interesting? And we did stories about, the sort of rewilding that was going on. We did stories about attempts to get the population back up. We did stories about debt, about the weird housing market. I think that role of the foreign correspondent, telling people about, there's a genre of stories that we've talked about before, you and I, Michael, called Weird Japan stories, and I think I've written enough of them myself. I think that's part of the remit of foreign correspondence. But what I tried to do was to tell stories about Japan that showed Japan, yes, it's different, but it's different in a way that the rest of the world will probably also experience. I remember reading an essay about 20 years ago, maybe it was by Carl van Wolferen, when there was a vogue. Actually, it's more like 30 years ago. There's a vogue for saying that Japan would become like the rest of the world. And I think one of the interesting things that happened was that the rest of the world became more like Japan, over the last 30 years, not in all ways, but in many ways, particularly around the role of, government debt, slow growth, depopulation, aging population, and so on.
Okay. And before we do move to the off-the-record patron session, is there any final comments you'd like to make to the global audience that'll be seeing this on YouTube?
Well, I mean, I think of my job as being, I think a lot of people think of correspondence as being some kind of oracles. We know everything. I don't think that at all. And the first thing I do when I sit down with my students is I say, I want to hear what you think, right? I think that being a foreign journalist, being any kind of journalist, the most important thing to do is to listen. And I'm amazed by how few journalists listen. They really don't. So what I would say to people is, get in touch. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you think, not about only about what I've said, but about what you think. And who knows, maybe they'll end up in the book.
All right. Thank you very much. And now we do move to the patron Q&A.